I'm going to share with you some hacks and tips for making great looking structure kits on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and if you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques, then be sure to subscribe down below and click that little bell icon so you can catch future videos. Well, today I am building a high-quality craftsman structure kit. And as I do, I'm going to share with you a variety of hacks and tips that can help make this process easier and help you make some fantastic-looking structures for your layout. So without further ado, let's head on over to the workbench and we'll get started. This video is brought to you by Midwest Model Railroad. Now with 15,000 square feet and one-day shipping, they truly are your one-stop model railroad shop. MidwestModelRR.com, link in the description. The kit that I'm working on today is the N-Scale Miner Supply from Wild West Models. I'll supply a link to Wild West Models in the description down below, as they carry a number of great craftsman kits in a variety of scales. One of the great things I love about Wild West Models is that their kits come with some of the best instructions I have seen. Now, this kit was part of my NMRA division's annual Make and Take clinic, so I started a couple of the early steps in the meeting and didn't get them on video. But the only thing not recorded was cutting out some of the main wall sections and aging them by scraping a razor saw along the wood in the direction of the wood grain to bring out that wood grain detail. And I used the back of the point of my hobby knife to carve away at the ends of a few of the boards to create the texture of wood that has started to rot away. I did this on some of the walls that were made from vertical boards and will be natural unpainted wood, and you'll see how I did this in some other steps a little bit later in the video. You can see these areas here at the bottoms of the walls and where the vertical boards meet. They appear as slightly darker areas when I apply the stain. The first hack to make structures look really good is to build up color slowly. I will stain these bare wood walls in layers from light to dark. I'm reproducing a look where the wood is still light colored at the top of the wall where it's protected by the eave of the roof, is starting to rot along the ground, and is quite weathered and slightly moldy in places in between. The first layer of stain is a light golden brown color. This is a stain I mixed myself using 90% distilled water, 10% flow aid, and is colored with acrylic ink to the desired color. Many people will install bracing on the back of wood walls before painting and staining them, but I wanted to retain the option to detail the interior of this structure, so I didn't want to add the inside bracing. Instead, I laid the freshly stained pieces on a hard, flat surface, covered them with a paper towel, and weighed them down with a flat, heavy weight until they were completely dry. This keeps the parts perfectly flat. When the first stain was completely dry, I added a black stain made in the same way. In this case, I didn't stain all the way up the wall, but I left the light color at the very top. I also stained the backs or the inside of the walls with a Hunterline medium wood color. With the outsides partly dry, I applied some green homemade stain to the ends of the boards to get a slightly moldy, mossy look. Again, after each layer of stain was applied, I weighed the walls down to dry flat. When that step was dry, I applied some Hunterline gray stain, mostly to the bottom. At this point, I was trying to darken the walls up to give more of a weathered wood appearance. The floor section includes both the interior floors and the outside boardwalk and porches all in one piece. I stained this piece with Hunterline medium wood stain first. After it had dried, I added another coat of the stain to the outdoor portions. Some of the walls would be painted with a peeling paint effect. These walls were also treated with Hunterline medium wood stain. When they had dried, I applied the peeling paint. Here is a second great hack. To create a peeling paint effect on wood, I first paint the wall with mineral spirits and let it soak in a bit but not completely dry. I then painted the wall using a fairly thick craft paint. Cover the wall well and let the paint dry to the touch but not completely. When dry to the touch, I used a piece of painter's tape to stick to the surface of the paint and then peel it away. I repeated the tape peeling process until I had achieved the level of peeling that I desired. I only worked on a couple of walls at a time because if the paint dries too much, the peeling will not work as well. I had decided that this structure would be an abandoned old hardware store, so I used the hardware sign detail included in the kit. Hack number 3, I used the method of scraping the ends of the sign with the back of my hobby blade in order to wear them as I had the wall sections. I used the same technique on the ends of the boards along the boardwalk and the porches, as well as the rear porch roof. In some cases, I scraped the end of the board away entirely. I treated each board individually. This yields a very realistic appearance as each board weathers and breaks and rots at its own rate. I also dry brushed on some light gray paint to weather and vary the color of the individual boards. Don't forget to color the ends of the boards where they will show, such as on the boardwalk. I applied this fading gray paint in a couple of coats as the boardwalk seemed a bit too dark to me. I was trying to lighten it up a bit. I also painted the edge of the floors gray. When all of the wall sections were stained and painted, it was time to turn to the door, window, and trim details. These are laser cut from thin plywood, which takes stain and paint a little bit differently, but I used a similar process to make them look old. I stained them with Hunterline light gray stain. This stain didn't color the plywood much, so I ended up applying 2 coats. Again, I weighed these details down flat until completely dry. When they were dry, I cut the door slabs from the carrier sheet as they will be a different color than the trim pieces. I painted the rest of the carrier with mineral spirits and then with light green paint and peeled it with the tape as before. The paint didn't peel as well on the plywood, so I would later scrape some of the green paint away to reveal the weathered wood below. I did the same with the door slabs, except I painted them white. I cut the detail parts from the carrier and stuck them to a piece of painter's tape to keep them under control. When all of the details were ready, I started installing the windows. One mistake I made was I forgot to paint the inside of the first window before adding the glazing. You'll need to paint the insides if you want to detail the interior of the structure. The window sashes install separately and glaze separately. This makes it really easy to model an open window if you choose. Another hack you might want to try is modifying the window or two to be open. This creates a sense of life and action to a structure or scene. An open door can also help create the same effect. I glued the entire structure together using canopy glue. I applied fine amounts of glue with the handle of an old, superfine micro brush with the head twisted off. The sashes are installed from the back of the wall. The window glazing is pre-cut and clearly marked. The canopy glue holds the glazing in place without hazing the window. There are trim pieces for both the inside and the outside of the windows and doors. The doors install similarly, with first the decorative mullion-looking piece installed from the back, then the slab on top of it, and then the jamb trim on the inside. With this kit, I had to take care as there are 2 sizes of doors and 2 sizes of windows. When the doors and windows are installed, I turned the walls over and installed the exterior trim. The front wall has some extra decorative trim pieces above the doors and windows. You will note the spot where I sanded most of the paint away. This is where I planned to install the sign. I wanted to make the sign look like it was falling down on one end and had been painted around on the building for years. I think the effect came out rather well. The windows on the unpainted walls were installed in the same way. The board detail on the back of the false front is cut from plywood, and the grain of the plywood carried over across the boards, which made it a little bit of a problem to look realistic. It took a combination of stain and gray weathering on the individual boards to make this piece look right. When I had it to where I was happy with it, I glued it to the back of the wall with canopy glue. The cornice had to be built from several pieces. There are 3 flat pieces that stack together to make the main sections. These I stained, cut apart, sanded, and glued together, carefully aligning the mounting holes. I then treated them with the same peeling paint effect that I had used before, using the same green paint that I used on the windows and door trim. When dry, I thought the bare wood portions looked a bit light, so I overcoated the entire piece with Hunterline gray stain. There are tiny brackets that hold the cornice together. I stained these in the carrier sheet and applied the peeling paint effect before removing them from the sheet. I cut the brackets from the carrier sheet, then glued the first piece of the cornice flat against the front wall, aligning the mounting holes. I installed the brackets in the mounting holes. This step was quite tedious as these are very tiny parts. When all the brackets were in place, I added a dot of glue to the top of each one, then installed the top of the cornice on top of them. I repeated this process on both portions of the front wall. I do have to say that for all the tiny pieces included, these cornices went together very well and were much easier to assemble than I thought they would be. Finally, it was time to assemble the structure. I was careful to use sparing amounts of glue in only places of tight concealed contact. I first glued the front wall to the floor section, then proceeded to add the other walls in the order suggested by the instructions, being careful to make sure that all of the joints were tight and square. It was at this point that I knew I was going to like how this structure would turn out. I left off the optional front porch roof, but I built the back porch roof from the pieces supplied. These parts are notched and go together quite nicely, despite their very small size. After the rafters were assembled, I weathered all of these wood pieces with some gray paint to fade and age them. As this is going to be an old abandoned building, I decided to make the back porch roof with a hole in it. When I install scenery around this structure, I will model a tree with a broken limb that has fallen through this roof. One long piece of angled wood is supplied for all of the corner trim. This piece has to be cut to length with angles and some pretty fancy cuts to fit their respective places. I measured each piece's length with a caliper and transferred those measures directly onto the trim piece. The instructions give good illustrations of the fancy cuts, but this process takes time and patience. I started with the hardest cuts first, in case I made a mistake and needed to cut something again, which I did. Fortunately, they include a little extra trim, so I had just enough with about 1/4 of an inch left over. As I cut each piece, I dipped it into Hunterline gray stain and set it aside to dry. Some of these trim pieces will be painted and some will be bare wood. I applied the peeling paint effect with the green paint to the appropriate pieces. The paint didn't peel very well on the trim, so I ended up scraping some of the paint away with my hobby knife. This came out looking good. Again, I thought the wood was a little light, so I dipped it again into the stain. The pieces that would remain raw wood were treated with the green stain just on the end that was closest to the ground. When the trim was dry, I glued it in place. The painted trim went on the walls that were painted and the natural wood trim on the natural wood walls. I cut the roof sections and supports from the carrier sheet, sanded the edges smooth, and since I'm considering detailing the interior, I stained all of these pieces in case they should show. I used Hunterline medium wood stain. Make sure to stain the edges of the roof sections as they will definitely show. I then weighed these pieces down flat until they were dry. When dry, I glued the roof sections together. Be careful to orient each of the pieces correctly. Once assembled, I test fit the roof onto the structure. The roof will remain removable on the finished model. The model came with roll roofing, but I wanted something a bit more detailed, so I applied green tab shingles from Motrac Models. Again, I'll provide a link to them in the description down below. These are very nicely laser cut from heavy paper material. I used double-sided tape to apply the shingles. Motrac includes a starter course, so I applied it to the roof edge first, then started applying shingles one row at a time. I started on the long side. I decided early on not to join ends in the middle of the roof, but to apply full rows of shingles. Short ends would be saved to use on shorter sections of roof and on the ridgeline. Trust me, I wasted none of these shingles. I started the first row with a full tab on the end and then trimmed it against the other end. The next row started with a half tab so the valleys stagger with each row. I simply repeated this process, full tab, half tab, full tab, half tab, all the way up the roof. I repeated the process on the other side. Here I had the added challenge of having two sections of roof that would meet up and mesh together. All I could do was be careful and hope for the best. I started with a small section of roof and worked up to where it would mesh with the add-on section. I then started at the bottom of the addition and worked my way up to meet the first section. When I reached the joint between the two, that course didn't line up perfectly, but it was close enough that most will never notice. Then it was just a matter of working on up to the ridge. A little canopy glue helps keep the top course in place as there is little tape surface left to hold it. For the ridge row, I cut pairs of tabs, folded them between the tabs around the edge of my hobby knife, and glued them to the ridge. The biggest issue here was the fact that double layers of shingles are unrealistically thick, but I couldn't imagine doing this job with a thinner material. The brick chimney was laser cut from wood. The brick detail seemed rather exaggerated and the brick faces a bit pointed, so I sanded the faces down a bit to get a more realistic texture. I measured the angle of the roof and sanded that angle onto the bottom of the chimney with my Micromark Sand-It. This is a very handy tool for jobs like this. I checked the angle of the chimney, and as it was way too tall, I marked the height that I wanted it to be and cut it off with my razor saw and miter box. I cut the chimney cap from the carrier sheet and glued it onto the top of the chimney. Unfortunately, I had forgotten to allow for the chimney before installing the shingles, so I had to mark the placement of the chimney, and using a new sharp number 11 blade, I carefully cut away the shingles where the chimney goes. This turned out to be easier than I expected. I also removed the tape from the hole. I painted the entire chimney a mortar gray color, making sure it really filled the mortar detail. When that had dried, I dry brushed the brick color onto the surface. This is the best technique I have found for getting brick and mortar lines to look realistic in N-scale. I built up the color on the surface in several layers. I also painted the top cap black. When the paint had dried, I glued the chimney in place. To simulate pitch used to seal the roof around the chimney, I painted a thin line of steam power black. This is a deep black color that remains shiny and oily looking. It took a bit of touch-up on both the shingles and the chimney, but I eventually got the look I was after. I thinned the edges of that ridge row a bit with a coarse sanding stick, which helped their appearance some. As good as the roof looked, I needed to age and weather it. Here are some great hacks for creating an old roof. I used a scratch brush to wear the edges of the shingles. I wore them more heavily towards the bottom of the roof and in areas where extra water would flow. I then used a sharp hobby knife to cut away single tabs and small sections of the roof to simulate an old, unmaintained roof. I was careful to remove the tape in areas where the wood showed through, as the tape is quite shiny and unrealistic looking. I applied a gray stain to the areas where the wood showed. I then dry brushed some light gray paint from the bottom up to lighten the shingles, especially on the edges, and give the appearance that some of the color had faded and washed away. I used Monroe weathering powders, medium gray and dark earth, to add weathering streaks on the roof. You have to be quite careful here, as a little of these powders goes a long way. I concentrated on areas below missing shingles, where water would flow, and below the chimney. I used some white powder to fade the roof and to tone down some of the streaks, as well as to fade and blend the boardwalk. And the structure was finished. This structure will be part of a diorama that I'll be entering into my NMRA Division's annual Modeling Challenge contest. When I install it on the diorama, I'll add some sort of foundation, and I may add those interior details as well. But at this stage, I think this weather-beaten old structure looks fantastic. Well, I couldn't be happier with the way this structure has turned out. I'm going to be building the diorama on which this structure is going to be featured for my division contest, the Modeling Challenge, and I'll be bringing you how I build all of that diorama and put it together very soon. I'm also going to try to bring you some video of the modeling contest itself, because I know you'll enjoy seeing all of the entries into that contest. Now, I have to say, I really enjoy building wood craftsman kits like this one from Wild West Models. They make fantastic looking structures on almost any layout. And if you want to see more about building craftsman kits like this one, watch how I built Blair Line's Leeton Depot. You can find that video linked in the corner of your screen right now. Be sure and check out my Amazon Pick of the Week and tons of other great links in the description down below. And if you'd like to see some more Model Railroad content right now, check out the links on your screen. And be sure and join me each Tuesday as I bring you even more great Model Railroad videos. And I look forward to seeing you then. 10, Lizzie?